Hey guys, Andrew at AED Source, and today we're going to be doing a bit of a fun video. We're going to be talking about the differences between AED uses that we see in popular movies versus what it's actually like in real life. But before we jump into that, go ahead and like and subscribe to this video and to this channel. We would love for you to be able to stay up to date and informed about future videos that we put out related to AEDs. So, let's talk about some of these videos. The first one that we're going to talk about is the James Bond movie from Casino Royale, where he gets poisoned and then ends up running out to his car. He has a little AED and he hooks it up to himself and he tries to shock himself. There's a few things that are not super accurate about this clip. First of all, the AED is really small, and I'd say it's about this big, and there are no AEDs that are that size. There are some small ones that are coming out on the market, but even then they're about this size here and they're about this thick. So you have to have enough room in there for the capacitor and other components to be able to generate enough electricity, or joules in this case, to shock a person. The second thing that is unrealistic about this is that it's supposed to be an AED, and AEDs can only shock ventricular fibrillation. But in the movie, they even say that he's going into ventricular tachycardia. And AEDs don't shock ventricular tachycardia for a few reasons. One, there's ventricular tachycardia with a pulse and ventricular tachycardia without a pulse. And so AEDs can't detect a pulse. They can only detect an electrical rhythm. So anyway, without getting too technical, there's a reason why it doesn't shock ventricular tachycardia, because it can't determine if there's a pulse or not. So you could never hook yourself up to an AED and shock yourself, because the only rhythm that it recognizes is ventricular fibrillation, which is this really sporadic rhythm. And that's the only one, because in ventricular fibrillation, you're not going to have a pulse. That is conclusive. So yeah, that's not super realistic there either. And so that's Casino Royale. Now, let's move on to another movie, and this is taking it back a ways, but E.T. So there's a point where the doctors get E.T., they bring him into the makeshift operating room, and he's going into cardiac arrest. And so they try they're doing CPR, they're discussing whether or not they should shock him, and fair enough, maybe you should question whether you should shock an alien or not. But in real life, on a human, that's not a question that you're asking yourself. You're going to want to shock somebody sooner than later. AEDs are very, very specific as to what they can shock and what they don't shock. So if you have somebody in cardiac arrest and you're doing CPR, if you have an AED available, that thing should be getting put on the patient as quickly and as early as possible. The second thing that we see that a lot of people, and this isn't just in E.T., but lots of movies, when you go to shock somebody in a movie, you usually see this response to that electricity, where usually their back will arch up and they kind of come off the table a little bit because there's such like high voltage. It's not even volts, it's joules. But anyway, that doesn't happen. In real life, there's very little movement that occurs, generally none at all when you shock somebody. You might see a little twinge of the skin on the chest, but beyond that, you don't usually have this full body convulsion when they get shocked. And so that's not realistic either. You don't need to be like on edge and worried about this person kind of like coming off the table at you when you shock them. All right, so the third movie is going to be Doctor Strange, where Doctor Strange is laying on this table in an operating room unconscious, and then he's in this kind of spiritual world battling this other individual, and then there's a doctor in the normal world who's trying to revive Doctor Strange. And so he goes into cardiac arrest. He flatlines, you see it on the monitor, and she takes her paddles and shocks him. Couple things there. First of all, these modern movies that are using paddles, nobody uses paddles anymore, where you hold them, press them against the chest and shock. I mean, those went away 15, 20 years ago. Now they're just stickers and you just slap them on, but it's not as cool. So But nonetheless, second of all, that device she was using with the paddles isn't an automated external defibrillator. It's not an AED. It's a manual defibrillator. There are literally you could see her pushing and allowing charging the device, and so she was regulating how many joules were being used. And then also there's buttons on those paddles that allow you to manually shock the person when you're ready to. So an automated external defibrillator, you put it on, it tells you when it's ready to shock, and it delivers the correct amount of joules based on what it thinks it should deliver. So all that being said is, yes, in a hospital setting, could you shock somebody who's flatlining with a manual defibrillator? Sure, but an AED, as I've mentioned multiple times now, can only shock ventricular fibrillation. It does not shock other. There are multiple rhythms that are considered cardiac arrest rhythms, but it only shocks one of them, and that's ventricular fibrillation. Flatlining, which is called a systole, or ventricular tachycardia without a pulse, are not rhythms that can be shocked with an AED. Hopefully this was a little bit informative and lighthearted. Obviously movies always are doing things for effect, but it does misinform people sometimes when that's your only exposure to how AEDs and cardiac arrest events occur. It does actually lead to misinformation, fears about these products. And what you need to know is that AEDs are extremely easy to use. They're intended for lay people who have zero training on CPR. And what you need to focus on is if you see somebody in cardiac arrest, calling 911 immediately, and then trying to locate an AED and turning it on, and from there the AED walks you through everything else that you're supposed to do. So hopefully that was helpful and informative. Again, this is Andrew at AED Source. Thanks for watching.